afternoon, everyone. Thanks for coming. My name is Jessaca Leinaweaver. I'm the director of the Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies here at the Watson Institute. And welcome to Watson for our panel, What is Happening in Venezuela? So in World Cup football, as you might know, there's a word, the group of death, or Grupo de la Muerte, refers to a group of four that's exceptionally strong teams and that only two of them can advance to the next round. And I was reminded of that group of four, or Grupo de la Muerte, when the United States president was speaking to the UN this week. He talked about four countries with special criticism, North Korea, Iran, Syria, and Venezuela. And there's a moment where I was thinking, is one of these things not like the other? And another way of saying that is, what is happening in Venezuela? So Venezuela is experiencing a political, social, and economic crisis, and for a number of complicated reasons, which our panelists will shed light on today. Many of us remember a key moment in Venezuela's recent history in March 2013 when Hugo Chavez died of cancer. He was the charismatic populist leader who helped to build a Bolivarian revolution and was closely aligned with other leftist governments in Latin America, like Evo Morales in Bolivia, the Castros in Cuba, and Rafael Correa in Ecuador. And many of the social reforms that were associated with Chavez were made possible through oil revenues in Venezuela. The year after Chavez died, in April 2014, CLACS held a conference here, a one-day conference on Venezuela. It was called Venezuela After Chavez, Challenges of Democracy, Security, and Governance. And at that point, more than 3 years ago, it was already clear that serious challenges faced the country. And by the way, two of our three panelists today participated at that conference as well. And the proceedings are available on our website if you'd like a primer on what some of us were thinking about Venezuela at that point. So back then, as Verónica Zubillaga wrote in her summary of the conference, the participants all remarked on the flagrant concentration of power during Maduro's presidency. And Verónica goes on, this narrowing and weakening of democracy can suffocate the very spaces of vindication and participation which opened to the popular sectors during the Chavez era. This trend threatens to undermine political accountability for the sake of preservation of power, which will turn Venezuela's near future into a dark horizon of an authoritarian regime and undercut the initial optimism generated by the expanded participation of the popular sectors during the Chavez period. So it sounds very prescient. Recently, under a new president, Nicolás Maduro, as economic crises and political change affected many countries in the hemisphere, Venezuela is also in crisis. In political terms, Maduro's government is increasingly isolated. Venezuela's Supreme Court ruled in March to gut the opposition-controlled Congress. Maduro then created a powerful assembly populated by loyalists, which was charged with rewriting the Constitution. And meanwhile, there are waves of protests in the streets going on, accompanied by government suppression of dissent. And meanwhile, in everyday life, it's the fourth sustained year of economic collapse. Inflation is in the triple digits. The state oil company continues to report falling revenues. There's severe shortages of food and medicine, and many thousands of Venezuelans have left the country. So the three scholars who will join us today will frame for us what is going on in Venezuela and what the experience of daily life is like and what Venezuela's role is for Latin America and for the United States as well. So I'll introduce the three of them, and then each will speak for up to 10 minutes, and then afterwards they'll take your questions. So it's an excellent opportunity to find out what is going on and find out more about the challenges that are facing Venezuela and Venezuelans from three people who are very closely involved with the country. So our first speaker comes to us live from Venezuela. She will appear here like a Jetson. It's Verónica Zubillaga. She is a sociologist whose research examines urban violence in Latin America. Hello, Verónica. I hope. She is a professor at the Universidad Simón Bolívar in Caracas. She was very recently in residence at Brown in 2014 and 15 as the Craig M. Kogut Visiting Professor of Latin American Studies. And that was followed by a stay at Harvard in 2016 when she was Santander visiting scholar. In recent years, she's worked toward combining academia with public impact in the domain of social violence, particularly promoting a public policy for arms control and disarmament. Her current project is a study of firearms proliferation, illicit economies, and the militarization of citizen security in Venezuelan homicides, for which she and her co-investigators, Manuel Llorens and John Suto, received a grant from the Open Society Foundation. We'll next hear from Naomi Schiller. Here she is. She is an assistant professor of anthropology at Brooklyn College, CUNY. Dr. Schiller's research and teaching focus on the media, the state, ethnographic film, social movements, and politics in urban Latin America and the United States. And she has a book coming out soon from Duke University Press. It's called Channeling the State, Community Media, and Politics in Venezuela. And it explores how community media producers from poor neighborhoods in West Caracas used television to advance political change during Chavez's presidency. Professor Schiller is also an ethnographic filmmaker and has worked collaboratively with media producers in Caracas to produce short films. And then finally, we'll hear from Andreina Torres, who's a doctoral candidate in anthropology at CUNY Graduate Center. She's also a researcher at Venezuela's Institute for Advanced Studies, or the Fundación IDEA. She holds a Master of Science in Gender and Development Studies from Flaxo, Ecuador, and she completed a thesis on the criminalization of female drug mules in Ecuador. She then spent 5 years as a junior researcher and professor in Flaxo's Urban Studies program, where she participated in research projects on prison studies, gender-based violence, and public safety policies. And her current research is an ethnography of a state-sponsored land occupation and housing project in Caracas. So I'd like to thank these three colleagues for taking the time to think about Venezuela together with us today, and I'm looking forward to learning from them. Also, a special thanks to Oriana Van Praag, one of our undergraduate students who was instrumental in bringing this panel to fruition. And then finally, I'd like to remind you that the session's being live streamed and recorded so that you can revisit the conversation in months ahead by going to CLACS's YouTube channel. And now, without further ado, we will turn it over to Professor Verónica Zubillaga, live from Venezuela.
Hi, thank you so much. Thank you, Professor Jen. Do you hear me?
Almost.
Yes.
We're waiting to crank it up. Can you keep speaking?
Do you hear me?
Yes, great.
Okay. Okay, so thank you, Professor Jessaca Leinaweaver and Kate Goldman and Oriana for inviting me. I'm so glad to be with you today. And hi, Naomi, Andreina, and everyone there. So I will bring you some informal reflections about what I think has been happening, put in context what is happening in Venezuela, highlighting some important already highlighted. So I will go very briefly all over this, but I would like to highlight, of course, the death of President Hugo Chavez in 2013, and in 2014, the collapse of oil prices. So those are two very important landmarks to understand Venezuela's crisis right now. Of course, in 2015, we had the electoral victory of the opposition for the National Assembly. In 2016, the cancellation of the referendum and failure of dialogue attempts. And then in 2016, General Attorney denounced the Supreme Court's rupture of the constitutional order. And then we have, again, protests, massive protests and people in the streets. And finally, in July 31, we have the installation of the Constituent Assembly. But I would like to highlight that, yes, that we have had 4 months of massive protests where 152 people were killed. 73% of these deaths have been caused by fire guns, and 25% were killed by security forces, and 40% were killed by armed civilians. This is the information being revealed by, but what I would like to highlight is that on March 31, when General Attorney was denouncing the coup d'etat, she also revealed some very important information that was completely overshadowed. Killed by security forces. That means that the police forces were responsible for 21% of violent death in Venezuela. And also it is important to highlight that 87% of the killings were caused with firearms. So what I invite you to understand what is happening in Venezuela, I will invite you to see a wider picture, focusing on conflict and the rise of crime, and especially to precedent key processes such as the militarization of citizen security in Venezuela and the widespread use of weapons in what Chavez repeatedly called the Pacific but armed revolution. So I will continue putting Venezuela into context with the rest of the continent, with the rest of the countries of South America, only to highlight that during the 90s, it was Colombia who had the highest homicide rates. And then nowadays, it is Venezuela who has the country which has the highest homicide rates in South America. So Venezuela nowadays is compared only to Central America, I mean to El Salvador and Honduras, countries which had in the not so long ago formal bellic conflicts, wars, but we have not had any official war in the past. But just to show that in the present, after El Salvador, we have the highest homicide rates in the region. So what I understand of the concept I'm working with for militarization, I draw from Professor Catherine Lutz from Brown. So I understand militarization as a simultaneous process of practices and discourses where we can find the material and discursive nature of military dominance. We have also the legitimation of the use of force. So reality and any opposition is defined following the mode of warfare. We have also the shaping of other institutions in synchrony with military goals, and we can see civil society organizing itself for the production of violence. So this is important to understand what has been happening in Venezuela, and we can see it specifically in the militarization of citizen security, where the fight against crime is defined as a war. And then these pictures, we can see women, for example, fleeing and being attacked by militaries. This was a protest that was near a prison in 2012. And here is the list of the different military operations that have been launched since 2010, starting with the Dispositivo Bicentenario de Seguridad. Then in 2013, Plan Patria Segura, and then in 2015, the Operativo de Liberación del Pueblo, which means that you can read the meaning in such a name. Operativo de Liberación del Pueblo defines crime as a war. Also we can see the militarization of citizen security in the distribution of ministries in the Minister of Interior and Justice in the last 18 years. You can see that from 15 ministers, only 3 of them were civilian here. But the logic of militarization has also expanded to the rest of the bureaucracy, and you can see that we have a very important percentage of military leading ministries. That means that nowadays 37% of the ministries are led by militaries. This means that yes, we have militaries as ministries nowadays, and this happens also with the state governments. Half of them, 50% of the state governments the governors are, again, militaries. And the militarization of public security shows itself also in the massive incarceration of population. And of course, those who are going to prison are poor young men from the barrios. And also I wanted to highlight the important proportion of violent death perpetrated by security forces. Only in the last year, we can see that this important rise. So only last year, in 2016, the different security forces were responsible for 21% of the violent death. And homicide rates have only but increased. So the homicide rates in Venezuela last year were 70 homicides per 100,000 inhabitants. This means that only after El Salvador, Venezuela has the highest homicide rates in the region. And then I will go very briefly to my second part of this presentation. I also wanted to highlight the widespread use of weapons in what Chavez insistently called the Pacific but armed revolution, especially, of course, after the coup d'etat of 2002, we started to hear repeatedly that the Bolivarian revolution was a pacific but armed revolution. We traced at least 14 times in different discourses by President Chavez highlighting this pacific but armed revolution. And we can see also this matrix or this idea in the increase of yes, let me see. Oh, can I see where the presentation is? Because I think okay, so next one, yes. Oh, no, I'm sorry. Next one. Next one, I already said all that, I'm sorry. Okay, next one. Next one, we will continue. Next one, next one. Okay, next one. Okay, so next one, and then next one. Okay. Okay, there. Well, I'm sorry. There is this decalage between what I've said and what I'm showing, but I will continue anyway. So in this graphic, what I wanted to show is that there has been an important increase of firearms imports. So you can see the blue line is the increase of fire guns imports, and the red line is the increase of homicide rates. You can see that already in the end of the 90s, there was an important increase of fire guns imports, but then after 2000, we can see a very important increase in the imports of fire guns. So next one. Then you can see the rise of the percentage of homicides caused by fire guns. In 1997, 73 of the homicides were caused by fire guns, and then 2013, homicides were 89% of the homicides were caused by a fire gun. Next one. So nowadays, Venezuela, after Puerto Rico, is the country that has the highest proportion of homicides caused by fire guns. And then next one, the important effect or the devastating effect of fire guns you can see in this map. So this is 1999, and then next one. the next one, okay, so this is 2011. We are building the new ones. So I will finish saying that 2017, for me, it was a sort of turning point in the sense that that year, President Maduro started in a military exhibition using this enormous fire gun or fusil, saying that we can take 10,000 or 20,000 of these to the barrios and fields to defend the Bolivarian revolution. So if Chavez before said that the Bolivarian revolution was a pacific but armed revolution, then we can raise the question if are we in an armed revolution? I mean, it looks like it is not pacific anymore. And finally, in June 27, indeed, we had President Maduro saying that what we failed to achieve with the votes, we would do it with the weapons. And to end, this is the next one. Next one. Okay. And the last one. Okay. So this picture, that picture, I took it from very near my home, only to end trying to show this military vision of reality and how any opposition is understood as an enemy. This is a civilian population confronted by military tanks and you can see soldiers. So I will end there. I'm sorry for the decalage between my talk and the presentation, but I will finish here. Thanks.
Thank you. That's okay. Thanks so much, Veronica. Next up is Naomi Schiller.
Hi, good morning, everyone, or good afternoon. Can you hear me?
It's okay.
So thank you, Veronica. I also wanted to make a plug for Veronica has a really great participation in a roundtable on violence in Venezuela that just came out in NACLA, a magazine, a journal called NACLA, Report on the Americas, which I just read. So thank you for that, Veronica. And if you're interested, she's too humble to plug her own stuff, but I found it really helpful to think through the presentation there as well as an extension of what you were just describing. So I want to thank the organizers, Catherine, Jessica, and Oriana, who I have not yet met, but thank you. It's a pleasure to be part of this conversation. I think it's a really difficult moment for so many people around the world, and understanding the current crisis in Venezuela isn't easy. I think we're all struggling to figure out how to explain, how to analyze, what perspectives to take into account to understand the current conjuncture. But I'm so glad that we have Verónica Zubillaga and Andreina Torres to provide analysis that's really grounded in most recent events and struggles in Venezuela. So let's see. So as I see it very broadly, the crisis Venezuela now faces is a result of at least three things. First, the enormous difficulty of altering the structure of dependency created by the monocrop export economy, basically Venezuela's dependence on oil, right? Second, the debilitating pressure imposed by national and international interests who seek to destabilize any effort to advance any kind of anti-capitalist political project. And third, the Bolivarian revolution's chaotic and ad hoc processes of change, which diffused institutional capacity for control and also made room for intense corruption. It also made it quite difficult to address problems as they arose. So in Venezuela, we have seen both the Chavez and the Maduro government deepen Venezuela's dependency on oil. Maduro, who was narrowly elected after Chavez's death in 2013, continued a deeply flawed exchange rate policy. This combined with a precipitous and sustained decline in the global price of oil in 2014, a very recalcitrant private business sector, has created major inflation and contributed to widespread scarcity in food and medicine. The important gains made by the Bolivarian Revolution in social equality and poverty reduction have largely been lost. People are trying to cope within a very violent and unstable economic and political context amidst massive opposition protests and government efforts to shore up its own power. So the recent sanctions imposed by the Trump administration will make things worse, much, much worse, for the most vulnerable. What I want to do today is to provide some context to understand the experience of a group of social movement activists who helped build the Bolivarian Revolution under the leadership of Hugo Chavez and who continue, despite their fierce criticism, to see the Maduro government as the only current available way forward, as they see it, to create conditions in the long run for a better future for Venezuela's poor. So I'll explore why many of the activists who I've studied continue to call for unity with Maduro despite their rejection of many of his policies and approaches. I think it's vital to understand the relationship between social movements and the Bolivarian state under Chavez in order to understand the present. So I'll talk briefly about the ethnographic research that I conducted with community media activists at a community television station called Katia TV, at the height of the Bolivarian movement in 2006-2007. I'll just say here it's important to note that different media activists and social movement groups chose very different kinds of engagements with state institutions under Chavez. There was a large spectrum of autonomy and interrelationship. The group that I worked with, Katia TV, chose to embrace and engage collaboration with state institutions and actors, and I'll talk a little bit about why. So I want to highlight their history under liberal democratic governments prior to Chavez's election in 1998 and how they came to understand the state as an uneven, inconsistent work in progress through their efforts to build the movement in the first decade of the 21st century. So just to give you a little bit of background and popular experiences of liberal democracy prior to Chavez. And also about the research that I did. So for about 18 months between 2003 and 2009, I lived and worked with poor and middle class activists involved in building this community television station, Katia TV. Katia TV takes its name from a poor neighborhood of West Caracas known as Katia. Activists from a barrio, or a poor neighborhood, planted the seeds for the station in 1989, shortly after the Caracazo, the massive urban uprisings against the implementation of structural adjustment policies. So Katia TV's founders rejected alignment with the two dominant political parties who controlled politics from the formal founding of democracy in 1958. These ruling parties engineered a formal liberal democracy that allowed elites to maintain control of Venezuela's oil and largely curtailed political participation to elections. To many outside observers, Venezuela seems stable and relatively prosperous, especially in contrast to the conditions of state violence, war, and dictatorship that plagued many other Latin American nations at the time. These celebrations, however, overlook the fact that substantive political participation, social equality, and access to resources remained elusive for the vast majority of Venezuelans. Indeed, despite prominent claims that Venezuela had a racial democracy that avoided the virulent race-based discrimination in the United States, the unequal distribution of resource and political power largely fell along racial lines. During oil booms, leaders used oil-derived wealth to create spectacular development projects that made the state seem magical and out of reach, as the late Fernando Coronel has argued. After the price of oil plummeted in the 1970s, Venezuelan government adopted neoliberal economic principles to reduce state support for public welfare, which proved disastrous, especially for the poor. So the takeaway here is that many urban poor, including my research participants at Katia TV, experience liberal democratic governments as politically and economically repressive and paternalist. Class injury was intertwined with gender depression and racism. Katia TV's founders' desire to make their own television programming stemmed from their identification of mass media as a central adversary in their efforts to encourage their neighbors to engage in politics. Despite their skepticism about the ability of the kind of democracy that they grew up in, one that was liberal and capitalist, to create a free and fair society, the activists I worked with had not given up on the state as an apparatus that ideally worked to secure socioeconomic security as well as political rights. My interlocutors at Katia TV assumed that it was common sense that Venezuelans have rights not only to vote or express their opinions, which we generally think of as political rights, but also socioeconomic rights, including access to shelter, food, healthcare, and education. They didn't see the state, as some Marxists do, as the inevitable instrument of a capitalist ruling class, and nor were they persuaded by some liberal beliefs that the state could or should remain autonomous from society and the economy. So with the election of Chavez in the late 1990s, the government joined forces with many active social movements to create a very complex web of new programs in healthcare, education, housing, and media, some of which granted leadership to grassroots groups, while others replicated previous patterns of paternalism. At the same time, Chavez concentrated power in the executive branch and centralized leadership in his own hands. Chavez declared in 2005 that Venezuela was on the road to building 21st century socialism. And socioeconomic indicators for the period between 2003 and 2012 reveal improved life conditions for the population. At the time of my research in 2007, Katia TV had 30 paid staff members, hundreds of volunteers. It broadcasted locally produced programming about everyday life and problems in poor neighborhoods, including problems with state institutions, for about 10 hours a day. The station relied on state support through publicity contracts and direct grants from PDVSA, the state oil company. In the midst of high oil prices and in the face of intense everyday pressure from the right wing to undermine the Bolivarian movement, the deep inconsistencies, contradictions, and tensions of the project of building socialism on the foundation of a capitalist, extractivist, oil-based economy were largely sidestepped. So building a post-extractive economy was not on top of their to-do list. So how do we think about Katia TV? How do we think about their view of the state, right? So Katia TV producers aim to encourage people in low-income barrios to recognize their capacity not only to make TV, but also to remake the broader web of institutions and social relations that they called the state. From my interlocutors at Katia TV, the state was not a fixed or uniform thing, but rather a potentially revolutionary set of institutions and a process in gestation, a terrain of struggle, right? So they really didn't see it as a monolithic thing. They saw very different state institutions as having different ideologies, different sets of people working within them, different possibilities, some of which they found were much more open to their projects for popular empowerment, and some of which were very closed. My effort to document Katia TV's work in poor neighborhoods and state institutions revealed how interactions and relationships could rarely or cleanly be accurately characterized as from above or from below, right? So much of the discourse about the Bolivarian Revolution throughout, was this a top-down, was this a bottom-up? And one of the arguments that I've been making consistently, I think, is that there were so many blurred boundaries between what were popular grassroots initiatives and the way that people were working with state institutions that oftentimes it was very difficult to recognize, there were no clear-cut boundaries, right, between what was from above and from below. Other times it was very clear, right, and there was very top-down orchestration, or there was very, popular movement, but most of it was very mixed and confusing. Poor people were involved at various institutional levels and collaborated with middle-class allies to advance social change. Over the course of my research, I saw Katia TV producers wrestle with their relationships with official state institutions and agents, which were simultaneously constraining and enabling. Katia TV producers interchanged knowledge, material resources, symbolic and material power with people working within state institutions. So although barrio-based activists and their allies face intransigence, corruption, and confusion in many of their dealings with state institutions, Katia TV producers argued that really the only way to resolve problems and advance popular leadership was to encourage broader participation in barrio-based programs aligned with the Chavez government. Rather than seeking to create autonomy apart from the state institutions, KTTV producers demanded that they be able to participate in the remaking of these institutions. The pressing question for them was not how to assert autonomy from the state so that they could criticize it. Instead, these media makers continually asked whose state they were constructing, which social class the state represented, and how to expand social justice and equality as they developed relationships with members of the middle class who had long monopolized influence over official state institutions. To engage revolutionary statecraft in and through Venezuela's already existing liberal capitalist state institutions required KTTV producers to embrace the reality of a very uneven playing field. They chose not to wait until they enjoyed the conditions of equality with their allies to act, or to try to construct socialism outside of these relationships. But this process was conflict-ridden, frustrating, and exhausting. It left them vulnerable, but they wagered that this vulnerability was worthwhile. Okay, so I guess I'll move to this part where, so I want to make clear that KTTV producers in their often, and I think there's a continuity of discourse about Venezuela and the problem of the state that says that, you know, Venezuelans are too dependent on the state. They remain clients on the state. They are, they don't have the work ethic, and I've seen people say this, that they don't have the work ethic to do what needs to be done, right? They're too dependent on the state. They think the state's going to resolve all their problems. And I think that while that might be true for some part of the population, I think what it really overlooks is what the state means to people and the different things that the state means to people and how this meaning changes over time. So KTTV and other activists didn't wait for outside forces of unseen bureaucrats to do the work that needed to be done. They engaged in everyday statecraft of building the Bolivarian revolution by attending long meetings, working in soup kitchens, volunteering in local healthcare clinics, engaging in oversight programs, caring for the homeless, attending and facilitating educational workshops. Sometimes they were paid by state institutions and sometimes they weren't. To grant the complex and uneven project of the Bolivarian Revolution any chance of success required constant mobilization, community organization, and continuous performance and displays of popular empowerment to deflect criticism and encourage participation. This was challenging labor, but also meaningful. This work created social ties, granted them status in their neighborhoods, and reaped rewards of better health outcomes, nutrition, and education. It gave them dignity and hope. My interlocutors carried out this collective labor in the face of fierce right-wing reaction from forces at home and abroad. So what went wrong, right, to update a little bit. So the last time I was in Venezuela was 2015, so already in the midst of crisis, although the crisis has gotten a lot worse. KTTV producers faced formidable challenges in asserting popular leadership of state institutions. And while they were doing that, they were much less attuned to analyzing and trying to intervene in the problems of Venezuela's dependence on the global oil market. Their horizon and practice of statecraft was focused on the local, the national, and the short term. They avoided confronting many internal problems within Chavismo, particularly of class inequality, gender oppression, and the widespread corruption, which in the long run has made it much more difficult to maneuver and face the current crisis. Many middle-class leaders continued to view the poor as passive audiences who could not be trusted to analyze the complexity and ongoing problems of building revolution. The ad hoc, constantly changing approaches, the half measures, the new institutions every 5 minutes, the new programs every 10 minutes, the uneven distribution of benefits, and the constant all-out campaigns to defend the Bolivarian process were exhausting and deeply demoralizing. So today, to talk about KTTV today and the rejection of the opposition. So the poorest have been hardest hit by the current economic collapse. KTTV is struggling to stay in operation without financial support from state institutions and the new challenges of everyday survival, which really eat up people's time and make it impossible to think about any kind of political strategy long term. There is tremendous heterogeneity of experiences and opinion. I think that's really important to emphasize. There is incredible heterogeneity of experiences and opinion, both among the opposition and among people who continue to identify themselves as Chavistas, right? People have very different takes about what's going on. Some of the KTTV producers I worked with broke with Chavismo around the time of Chavez's death, but most continue to identify with Chavismo and very reluctantly to call for unity with Maduro. In the face of claims that the Bolivarian revolution has faltered because of failed socialist policies, my informants at KTTV assert that the problem has been that the government has not been socialist enough. The Chavez government's contradictory approach to socialism combined efforts to collectivize property and production while at the same time leaving considerable portions of Venezuela's privately controlled banks and manufacturers untouched. KTTV activists see Chavez's and Maduro's efforts to work with national private businesses as creating the conditions for deep cronyism and government corruption. But the perspective of seeing the state as a process rather than as a coherent object to be captured once and for all, I think continues to inform radical activists who are deeply critical of Maduro but call for unity with the government. They see Chavismo as an incredibly complex and messy social field, but one that retains possibility. For some of my research participants, this means continuing to work directly with state institutions. For others, this means building movements with much more autonomy and who do not work directly with state institutions. The people that I work with and who continue to support Maduro are under no illusion that Chavez or the current administration has been successful in building an alternative to capitalism, but they haven't stopped in trying to work towards that goal. So conversations with former KTTV producers and those still involved make clear that although they're wary and critical, they have tremendous skepticism about the opposition. This is deepened by recent violence and media representations of this violence, and importantly, the U.S. efforts to intervene through sanctions, which will only worsen shortages. And from the perspective of my research participants, at least, they feel that the opposition has welcomed these sanctions, which I think is complex. But just to give you a sense, one of the people I worked most closely with recently wrote to me, I assure you that, this is a quote, I assure you that if the government of the US and Trump hadn't meddled directly in our matters and if the opposition was less stupid, they would have been in power in the country a long time ago. They have to know that we will never go back to being a gringo colony and that we have advanced and we aren't going to allow things to go back. It's better to eat yuca and fried fish than return to being slaves. So I think we see in that kind of discourse and language, a strident anti-imperialist nationalism, and I think a clear and accurate description of the role, the really undercutting of any kind of change or dialogue that the role that the U.S. government has played. Obama as well, in calling the Venezuela a security threat to the United States. So the shortcomings of the Maduro government are serious and numerous, but my informants think that a call for regime change and an assumption that opposition rule will bring any kind of equality, justice, fairness, stability, or meaningful democracy is unwise given the lack of any clear program articulated by the opposition and the documented track record of many of the opposition leaders. So just to conclude, I think, what can we do? I think solidarity involves doing what is asked of us from people on the ground, and the complexity of the situation is that there are many perspectives and different asks, and people are looking for different kinds of things. I would say that number one, people in this country should reject any move by the Trump administration to intervene. I think it will only make matters worse, both from the perspective of people who are trying to advance the opposition agenda and people who are trying to and continue to try to work at the grassroots to advance social change. I think a lot of the conversation really overlooks that there are people in poor communities who continue to struggle to improve people's lives, and a lot of the conversation really undercuts that there continues to be grassroots mobilization taking place. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Naomi. Now we hear from Andreina Torres.
Hi. So my intervention is going to sound very raw because I just came back from Venezuela, from living in Caracas for 3 years doing fieldwork for my dissertation, which I haven't written yet. So, thinking about the title of this panel, I began to think about why is this question relevant today? I could tell you more about why I personally became interested in Venezuela as a site of research as I began to work on the housing question in the Chavez and post-Chavez era, when Venezuela was not yet what seems today the center of the world's attention. Since this is such a daunting question for me, what is happening in Venezuela, I prefer to speak from my lived experience as a middle-class Venezuelan who's also a graduate student in the US and more recently held a position as a researcher in a state institution in Caracas. There is no doubt that the past few months, most Venezuelans felt a sense that life, everyday life, had become almost unbearable. The reasons as well as the possible solutions can be explained from multiple angles, sides, ideological positions, but the net effect had no shades. Everyday life had become almost unbearable. For many, the only way out was to leave the country. Yet this feeling varied across classes, and I would add age, race, etc., but not in a straight manner The solutions proposed are also variegated, controversial, and most seem at this moment not very helpful. I want to share a few anecdotes that will help illustrate some impressions I had of the most recent events. Most of you may know already a lot about the political and economic situation, and I thank the previous panelists for giving the context, right? But you may know this because Venezuela's on the news almost every day, right? But I want to convey the ways in which there's no easy way to package the Venezuelan crisis as a good versus evil affair that I think is the most, what you see in the media, right? So Friday, December 15, 2016, in the midst of announcements about the withdrawal of 100 Bolivares bills from circulation, the mayor of Caracas, Jorge Rodriguez, announced the calendar for the new annual festival, Suena Caracas. In a context of seemingly collective madness and suffering, the announcement came almost as a slap in the face. The festival had been criticized in the past as yet another example of Chavista debauchery. How can the government spend millions of bolivares to offer free concerts with high-caliber international performance when we seem to be in the midst of a humanitarian crisis? And yet people massively attended the concerts. In a city where crime and fear, and Verónica talked about this, fear of crime has left us with few places to meet and enjoy the company of unknown others, for me the Suena Caracas festival always came as a well-received respite from self-imposed curfews and self-imprisonment in our homes. That night, Junior Kelly was the big name, and young reggae lovers from all walks of life from across the political spectrum filled the Diego Ibarra Square. I went there not knowing how I would go back home because my cash was no longer being accepted in the streets. A cab driver would not want to take me anywhere if all I had was bills of 100 bolivares. This is a story that I can explain better later. When the concert was over, I was amazed by how quickly the plaza emptied out. Most people had left before the closing of subway stations at midnight. Others had cars. And to my amazement, others had planned to take cabs and pay with bills of 10, 20, 50 bolivares. As I saw people pull out their packs of small bills, I became truly impressed by this strategy, one I hadn't even thought about. I was always impressed by how quickly people adapted to extraneous circumstances. It always took some level of provision and great creativity. Me and two other friends were left stranded. Walking at 2 a.m. in downtown Caracas was not an option. We were scared, and so we waited and made calls until a friend finally picked us up. Soon after, cab drivers began to implement ways to make payments via electronic transfer, an option that was hardly available around that time. A few months later, protests ensued. June 24, 2017. So I'm talking about very personal stuff. June 24, 2017, the headquarters of Otro Beta, an artistic social movement that I had come to admire, respect, and love, were burnt down in the midst of opposition protests. Fast forwarding to the days preceding the July 30th elections for La Constituyente, which I'm sure some of you know has been a very controversial election and move, I would say. I went to a CLAP meeting in my building. The CLAPs, some of you may know, Comités Locales de Abastecimiento, had been until very recently associated with low-income and Chavista territories, and yet Chavista neighbors in my building, a predominantly middle-class and opposition neighborhood in downtown Caracas, La Candelaria, some of you may know a little bit about Caracas, had organized to receive the CLAP boxes. This box was no small benefit. In a context of soaring inflation, for 10,000 bolivares, so around $1 at that time, the box contained the main staples of a Venezuelan diet: pasta, harina de maíz, dry milk, beans, rice, cooking oil, ketchup, mayonnaise, and tuna cans. That day, emotions were running high. There had been clashes between pro and anti-government protesters all over the city for about 3 months now. And more recently, there had been an episode near my building in which some residents gave refuge to opposition violent actors. The territorial coordinator of the CLAPs in the area announced that a new census would be conducted and signatures would be required. This unleashed a flurry of insults in the crowd. Apparently, there was a rumor that the signatures would be used in support of the fraudulent constituyente elections. A debate ensued about how voluntary was participation in the CLAP. The unsaid answer was that if they refused to sign, they would not get a box. But I was frustrated, as so were many others, by how little effort was put into clarifying information and denying rumors. I left the meeting as angry neighbors began their anti-government chant. Iba a caer, este gobierno va a caer. The day of and after elections. On July 30th, I wanted to vote, but I couldn't. I had to vote, so these are the elections for the Constituent Assembly. I had to vote in my hometown, Mérida, and conditions were not safe for me to travel. But even if I had traveled, I may not have been able to vote. That day I was in touch with a friend in Mérida who wanted to vote, but was locked inside her house by guarimbas. I can explain that later. Even though I had initially questioned a call for a constituyente at that moment, that day I was ready to vote. My vote would probably not come from a full endorsement of the Maduro administration and the party, the PSUV, but it was a vote against opposition violence, anti-Chavista violence, against the disruption of everyday life in an already difficult situation. It was a vote against the regional and international powers that have aligned to see Venezuela fail, against Trump and US interventionism in Latin America. It was a vote for a highly imperfect system, yet the only one that at this moment, for me at least, still creates openings for something new or something different. It would be a vote for those that walk around the street still dreaming and doing and fighting for, why not say it, a better world. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you to our three panelists for really different and extremely useful interventions. So right now I would like to open it to the floor for questions from the audience. If you'd like to know more about these different approaches, or different information about what's going on, what would you like to know?
Verónica can only hear if you're on the microphone, so if you just raise your hand, I'll bring it over.
Yes.
I'd like to know more about the private business interests that are still in business in Venezuela. And then I wonder what the Russian and Chinese interest is in, or interference or relations with Venezuela. So two very different questions.
Verónica?
Yes, well, what we are seeing is that, of course, there is the relationship with Russian and the Chinese have been getting the more and more solid. And I do agree with Naomi that the Trump's administration's sanctions are going to make things worse, and it will help to consolidate the Russian and the China's alliances with the government. So, but I mean, my research is not especially focused on these issues, but what we can see is that definitely there is a consolidation of the alliances between the Russians and the Chinese, and that all the Trump's administration's sanctions are not going to help. And we can see the more and more participation of the Russians, for example, in different businesses such as the Arco Minero in the south of the country, and that's it.
I guess I would just add, I mean, there has been some talk about Venezuela trying to move away from the dollar and towards other currencies for selling of petroleum. So I think there's an interesting conversation going on about, is that possible? What does that mean? What does that look like? Also not my area of expertise at all. I would say the small businesses, I would direct you to the work of Steve Elner, who's a historian who's worked, Ellner, who's worked and taught in Venezuela for decades. And he does really interesting work to think about the connections that Chavez tried to make, particularly post-2002 when there was a coup in Venezuela, and Fede Cámaras, which was the official business representative organization, came out strongly in against Chavez, was trying to oust him, and supported a 13-month strike. I can't remember how long the strike was. And so after that moment, Chavez really tried to build relationships with an emergent, smaller national bourgeoisie, owners of capital who were not aligned with these more traditional large business owners, and, you know, diverted funds, gave preferential rates, was really trying to strike a deal and figure out how to maneuver and make it possible, and in ways that, you know, people on the left were very critical of. So, and then Maduro, I think, has done that, you know, even more to a greater extent, is trying to find, so, and people point to this as like huge reasons of corruption and nefarious dealings between the private sector and the government, as the government tried to, you know, cultivate support and make markets work in some kind of way. I don't know if you guys want to add stuff to that, but that's sort of my understanding. But I've found the work of Steve Elner really helpful on that point.
Yeah, I don't know any work that has been done in this subject, but here the most controversial issue is the exchange the exchange rate, right? And how can private businesses have access to dollars and to preferential dollars? So there's been various schemes to do that. The first one was Cadivi, and Cadivi, you know, now it's known as this huge corruption.
Disaster.
Yeah, it was a disaster. There's people are calling for an investigation for all the private businesses that had access to Cadivi dollars and basically or ran away from the country or never sold those. Like most of them were importers who were supposed to sell within the Venezuelan market at lower rates, at lower prices. But they would get the dollars in a lower rate, and then they sell the products at a black market rate. So that made so inflation in Venezuela is very tricky to understand because it's not the usual. There's an economist who writes about this, Pascualina Curcio, and she talks about the whole question of the dólar paralelo, which is the black market dollar, which it remains like I'm not an economist. I don't understand it. I don't know how this rate is set, but she does make a connection between the political moment and the price of the dollar and how it just skyrockets. Just now, right before I left, the black dollar, I mean, it's just ridiculous how much it went up. Right, so this just makes the relationship with the private sector very tense. There was a new system that just came out. It's called DICOM, and it worked for it giving a lot of benefits for small enterprises and to get access to dollars. But now it has stopped because they want to change it. To turn it into a system where you can get access to euros and other currencies and not the dollar, and kind of try to diminish the importance of the dollar in our economy, which is just adds to the degree of dependency and all of that has been commented so far.
Other questions? Wait 1 second. Here comes the microphone. Okay.
Hi, sir, Ms. Torres. So you said that your friend was locked, wanted to go vote, but she was locked inside by someone. Who were they?
Guarimbas. Can you
So the
explain?
guarimbas, do you guys know what guarimbas are and what they? No? Okay. So the guarimbas started, I think, in 2014 was when they were started to use as a protest, as a way of protest. And it meant, I don't really know the details. There's like, of who created this, who gave this strategy, who thought it was a good idea to adopt it. But basically, residents, mostly, well, from the opposition, they will create roadblocks in their neighborhoods, their own neighborhoods. So it means that residents within their dependent from your ideological position, you are trapped in your neighborhood, basically, by these roadblocks that are not entirely peaceful at all. Like they can be burning tires, they can have Molotov cocktails, and so Mérida, which is my hometown, is a very strong opposition town, and we can talk about that why it is. But basically, if you went out the day of the elections, if you came out of your house, that immediately made you a target of anti-Chavista violence because it meant you were going to vote, even if you weren't going to vote, right? You were not trapped in your house, which was what the Guarimba wanted in some way, some strange way to, it just forced you to be inside. And that was one of the most excruciating parts of this whole period. And I'm not anti-protest and protest, and I'm not saying people don't have the right to protest or don't have many reasons to protest, and a lot of the protests were peaceful. But mostly they ended up in very violent situations. And so this friend of mine was trapped inside her house, and she was very scared of going out to vote because people knew her. People knew who she was, and they knew she was Chavista in a predominantly opposition neighborhood. And so she wasn't going to risk her life either, right, to go vote that day.
Yes, I will add that the first time we used the term guarimba was in 2004, where we had a period of protests. And it is indeed the expression of the arbitrariness of the opposition. But I want to highlight that it produced a lot of conflict among the opposition. I mean, people were furious that other people, in a very authoritarian way, didn't let you to circulate. And of course, there was a lot of racism among some people that who saw that dark-skinned people or people who had a different image were pointed as Chavistas, and that could be very aggressive. So, yes, I mean, it's interesting and it's necessary to think about what is happening also with all the complexities. So, yes, Guarimba was definitely very arbitrary movement especially in the middle class neighborhoods where you were forced not to circulate. I remind being trapped in a panaderia or in a cafeteria for 2 hours because neighbors didn't let me circulate. So, and it was, I mean, it was useless to discuss with them that it was ridiculous to do these sort of things. But you could see that people were very enraged and they felt that they had to do something to show their rage and impotence. So definitely it is a sort of pre-political movement.
Mm-hmm. And I think it has created an interesting political geography in many places in Venezuela where opposition have a lot of support. The protest is much more visible and trapping people in their homes in some cases, right? And then in poor neighborhoods where maybe the guarimbas aren't happening as much, although there is some of that in poor neighborhoods as well. So, but in some poor neighborhoods, life is going on completely as normal, and people have just vastly different experiences of everyday life and the reality of protests. So really experience day-to-day life very differently, and sort of the intense level of conflict is experienced quite differently in different parts of the city.
Yes.
Yep.
I'll try to be quick. I'm one of the assistant deans here, and I'm also from Venezuela, from Caracas. In my previous professional life, I worked for the Venezuelan government. I was a consular analyst in New York, and I was also a speechwriter and translator for the Venezuelan ambassador to the UN about 10 years ago. So what I find interesting, and I want to get the panelists' sort of view on this, is if you look at the way the Venezuelan situation is portrayed in the news, and now I consider myself much more of a moderate, but it seems sort of one-dimensional, and I'm sure you know many of our families are divided. The polarization is completely off the charts. But if you turn on, ABC, El País in España, or BBC, it's just sort of very one-dimensional, and nobody's talking about maybe some of the terrorist practices that are happening also in the opposition. And so the corruption is true, and that's happening in the government, and everybody's well aware. But I think unless we see both views, there's never going to be really a conversation in the middle of more moderates. That I'm sort of hoping that people have more access. When I have students or academic advisees that ask me about the situation, I have to tell them, maybe you want to check, Telesur, maybe you want to check Aporrea in conjunction with BBC and CNN to get maybe a more broad nuance of the situation. So I guess I wanted to know what you all thought about sort of how one-dimensional the situation is portrayed in the mainstream news. Thank you.
Well, Yes. Yes, definitely it is. Through the 18 years we have lived in the frame of the Bolivarian Revolution, I would say that we have had essentialist points of view, and it is very difficult to get a portray of what is happening in Venezuela. I remember in 2002 reading Le Monde Diplomatique. I lived in Belgium at that time. And again, I mean, I used to read that newspapers, thinking that it showed a complex point of view of the different political situations. And being Venezuela, what I read about the coup d'etat, of course, I was very critical with the opposition, but I found it didn't show the complex points of views. But you can find some digital media that are trying to make some efforts. Aporrea, I would say that it is an interesting media, and they are trying to include different points of view. So I definitely will recommend Aporrea to read. They have been opening their scope to different points of views. I will highlight other media such as Efecto Cocuyo, that it is definitely from the opposition, but I will say that they have a sort of compromise with trying to show certain complexity among things. For me, being in Venezuela, I think this period is different from the Chavez period. I will say that I feel overwhelmed by the military presence in daily life. So for me, it's the more and more difficult to find complexity, living and experiencing this important expansion of the militaries, of weapons every day. I mean, you go to a I don't know how to translate, a panaderia, I mean a place where you buy bread and coffee, and then you find soldiers with weapons. I'm doing field work in barrios, and then for me it's an absolutely contradiction that a socialist government is killing young men in barrios, and I am going particularly to La Cota 905, where the last military operation started, and there is a systematic pattern of human rights violations. So for me, it's becoming harder to find complexity when I feel overwhelmed by this military presence. So that was what I wanted to say. But definitely, Aporrea, Efecto Cucuyo, I think they are media that are worthy to read.
Yeah, and there's definitely, for some reason, a lot of good sources in English that you can, you always have to think about like who's writing and from what perspective, but there's venezuelaanalysis.com. They're obviously Chavistas, but they're I find it's a more systematic and kind of detailed journalism than other sources. There's this page, Venezuela blog, by Professor David Smiley. He always has interesting things there from his position. And there's a more recent one, Venezuela Dialogue, right, where there's a bunch of US scholars who have done research in Venezuela and are very divided in their opinions about what is going on and what is happening and what needs to be done in Venezuela.
I think I would just add that, I mean, I think things have changed in the media landscape since I did the bulk of my field work, but people continue to, I mean, no matter what political perspective people hold, in my experience, people check out the other channel or and are trying to, they don't have a lot of trust even in the perspective that they supposedly agree with being represented, so a lot of people really have a lot of doubts about state-run media, even if they're fervent Chavistas, and they would watch state media, and then they would also watch commercial media, which have, for the most part, express much more opposition-aligned views. So, and people sort of suss out, what is everybody saying? And I mean, I think people do that in the United States as well, and should do that, right? So, following many different, perspectives on Twitter, et cetera, to get a sense of what is the conversation, what's going on, and how people are responding. But I think what you're pointing to of the really one-sided perspective that we get in mainstream U.S. media, is overwhelming, and it gives people the sense of, when during my research, the big Chavistas talk about media war constantly, that there was a media war going on, and then it shifted to talking about an economic war that was going on. But I think people continue to feel that that there's so little accurate information being distributed, and that's a huge part of the problem of any effort to move forward, that the people have interest in really portraying a very limited analysis of what's going on.
Yeah, and I would add sometimes, in the past few months that I'm still processing what happened, things like Twitter or WhatsApp and those things that seem like they could be helpful in informing people, sometimes they were just terrible, because it was 2-second news, and they're like, oh, they're killing people, and some and the colectivos are killing people, and I'm like, so, and then you see the video and you don't get any context, and you don't get any, and it's just contributing to the state of fear and paranoia and war, basically. So
I think there's a lot of research to be done on the really negative impacts, actually, of social media in terms of fanning the flames of conflict, and people not checking sources and making snap judgments about what's going on. That's definitely clear. And also just constant trauma of trying to figure out what's going on and following what's going on, and really having it be a huge burden on daily life of trying to, I think, we feel some of that here with, particularly in the opening days of the Trump administration, at least, of just what's coming down next, what's going to happen. But I think that seems to be the, a constant state of being in many ways.
Yeah, the reason I asked, I was there last year,
Mm-hmm.
with family, my father's there, and we stayed in La Candelaria. People keep asking me, not everybody's missing toilet paper, not everybody's
Mm-hmm.
missing water, not everybody. So that people keep asking me here,
Mm-hmm.
does your family have water? Can they shower? Do they have soap? And that there are shortages, but it's sort of frustrating that that's the only conversation, the only amount of information that's getting out. That I think is overwhelming.
Yeah, and I think that's what I try to highlight, the strategies, the way that people strategize around this. It's not normal, right? There's a way that the not normal has become normal, and that's problematic. But people have strategies also to deal with not having toilet paper, right? The other parts are more difficult to deal with, the violence, the guns, the constant fear. That's way more difficult to deal with.
I just wanted to make one point about that I think is really important to underscore, is that needs to be part of the conversation, is when we talk about, a return, some people talk about a return to democracy or a deepening of democracy, or that we really need to talk about what kind of democracy people are talking about in terms of building. What does that really look like, right? And I think that is really at the root of a lot of the people that I worked with. Intense skepticism about opposition leaders is the lack of, just very broad things about we're going to return to liberal democracy in a market-based economy, and really, no clarity about what that means about social programs, and social dignity for the poor and working classes.
Thank you. I think there's time for one more question. Yep, there it is.
Yeah, thank you very much. I was listening to your, in particular, personal narrative, and it reminded me a lot about a recent novel that I read by Rodrigo Garcia Calderon, which is called The Night. I don't know if you know this novel, but it describes completely these circumstances of fear and terror in Candelaria and Caracas. And but then you were mentioning gender oppression, Could you please say like a few more words about specific features of this gender oppression?
Yeah, so the 1999 Constitution included, that was passed under Chavez, included really considerable gains for rights around gender equality, and held a lot of promise. But many of those gains were not actually made real or more permanent and made into law. They remain sort of enshrined in the Constitution, but were never put in place. So I think on a legal level, there continues to be a lot of work to be done. There was a strong platform and a push to, try to compensate women for domestic labor done in the home. What other things? Can you guys help me out? There's a chapter in my book on this, and so it should be much more on the tip of my tongue. But and what I saw at KTTV was that there was, among radical leftists, there was a real sidelining of the question of gender oppression and a privileging of a discourse of class, right? And so that, and which is not new, and we've seen this in many social movements in Latin America and elsewhere around the world, where that for many people they articulated as if we resolve problems of socioeconomic inequality, we would solve the problems of gendered oppression. And so I saw a real reproduction of gendered inequalities within the television station where I worked, where women were, did a lot of the labor in the background, but were not cultivating their own skills as public speakers in front of the camera. So they were behind the camera. They were doing a lot more work and breaking barriers in terms of gendered labor of media production. But in terms of vocal roles out front, they had less support. There was some, but there was less support. And the leadership of community media organizations in general continued to be very male-dominated. So, and just, an everyday lack of critical, I think, understanding about gendered inequalities going on around them. And that they were reproducing. And it wasn't a matter of, so some prominent feminists, Venezuelan feminists, argue that it was really, that some of these missteps were a result of state, the sort of top-down nature and Chavez's own very masculinist, militarist discourse, and that was sort of squashing grassroots movements. But one of the arguments that I'm trying to make was that these were the ongoing inequalities and patterns of gender oppression were very much reproduced within this collaboration between grassroots projects and state institutions. It wasn't simply a top-down kind of thing. So that, yeah, there was a lot of work to be done around that. Continues to be an issue. Yeah.
Well, just to add, because my work deals with the question of gender, and again, it's the contradictions, right? Mm-hmm. You have a rise in female leadership that is like, it's noticeable. Like if you go to any Consejo Comunal, or like the people I worked with, the housing activists that I worked with, women are the leaders, right? But there's also that dark side where women are also taking too much,
the triple
right?
burden. The
triple burden, doing too much work, and it's it's almost like the revolution is on their backs, and it depends on them and their organizational work. And so the deeper questions of gender are still not addressed. Like abortion is still illegal in Venezuela. Chavismo can be very conservative. It has a religious strand that evangelicalism is strong. So, I mean, again, the question of heterogeneity and complexity needs to be looked at in that sense as well.
So again, I'd like to thank the panelists. Andreina, your personal reflections, it's very raw and really helpful because it gives this, the way you wrote it and shared it, it really gives a sense of what it feels like to be in Caracas right now, sort of the role of a rumor and how powerful that is, and the fear, but also the creativity of everyday life, and that hilarious the use of 10 bolivares. And then
You can
that's
do
really,
that.
really interesting. And Professor Schiller, it was really helpful to hear the way the history of of social activists and how you step by step laid out how it makes sense for people to continue to support Maduro, even though has more authoritarian tendencies than were visible under Chavez. And to Professor Zubillaga, it's really useful to see you really mapped out for us the role of how violence has increased, sort of what are the roles of increase of violence, and firearm deaths, just imports, changes but also the militarization, sort of the discursive changes and the changes in citizen security. So it's really three perspectives that were very different, but that give us a very complete picture of what is going on today in Venezuela. So thank you all again, and please join me in thanking our panelists.